Hello, folks. I'm C. Eshelman, your host for Unmuted Love. In the next few episodes, I'll be diving into the sometimes prickly world of understanding reactive attachment. I'm calling these sessions Reactive Attachment Diagnosed and Undiagnosed. Buckle up now for part 1. Here we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm C. If you don't know me, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I own the Attach Place Center for Strengthening Relationships in Sacramento, California, and I'm an attachment and trauma specialist. So this is kind of my thing. Little caveat at the front. I want to just say that I think this is going to be wholly unsatisfying for you because I'm going to talk about this stuff, but I'm not going to tell you anything about parenting until part 2. There's just too much to cram into, an hour and a half. The title today is Attachment Challenges in Children and Teens, and that's diagnosed or undiagnosed because there's a little problem with diagnosing this, and I'll tell you about all of that as we move forward. My claim to fame as an attachment and trauma specialist is that I adopted 2 kids 25 years ago. Both had been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, and I had no idea on the planet what was going on because 25 years ago, this wasn't a thing. No one even talked about trauma-informed anything back then, so it was really something. Luckily, I was a therapist already, so I knew how to go seek information and to find the greats out there who understood attachment and trauma and got myself educated. And that's how I get to be here after all these years. But let me just say this. In the first 5 years of having my kids, I was clueless and I had no idea what I was dealing with. And it was pretty much an S show at my house every day. I wasn't sure who was more disturbed, me or them. So just know that this is hard if you happen to be raising children from difficult beginnings. What I want to start by saying is that chronic and severe negative experiences in infancy and early childhood can result in what is known as reactive attachment disorder of infancy and early childhood, or it could also be diagnosed as disinhibited social engagement disorder. Disinhibited social engagement disorder is actually a relatively new diagnosis compared to reactive attachment disorder. What the literature says is that it's very rare to be diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, which is actually true, but that's not because reactive attachment disorder is rare. It's because it's rare to get the diagnosis because no one wants to give the diagnosis. But if no one wants to give the diagnosis, then what happens is we mistreat what we're looking at, and that's problematic. So diagnoses come in and out of favor over time, and reactive attachment disorder is way out of favor. No one likes to give this because they think it's a little bit of a death sentence, right? That children cannot heal from this and that it's just going to be downhill from wherever you get them from. And that's actually not the truth, although it certainly can be the truth if you get a child who has attachment challenge of any kind, really, reactive attachment disorder diagnosed or not, but who does not get the right kind of intervention in terms of parenting. Parenting is the key to healing, not therapy, not medication, not treatment particularly. It's day in and day out. Therapeutic parenting is what heals children who have attachment and trauma challenges. So what I wanted you to see was the difference between reactive attachment disorder and DSED, which is disinhibited social engagement. They're 2 sides of the same coin. If you look at reactive attachment disorder, I'm going to read down the middle column so that you can hear the characteristics of it. You would be seeing in attachment behavior emotionally withdrawn and avoidant children who avoid comfort from their primary caregiver. The relationship would be strained. There would be selective attachment, and it would not be selecting the caregiver as the attachment object often. The child's distress response would be not to seek comfort, to be unresponsive to comfort, to even reject comfort. The affect of someone who was severely reactive attachment disorder diagnosed would be flat or muted, unexpressed sadness or fear, but also you might see a lot of anger, acting out behavior, a lot of in-your-face behavior, a lot of what might look like disrespect or oppositional behavior, or it might even look like PDA, which is pathological demand avoidance, which you can only get if you're diagnosed with autism, but it looks a lot like that, which is that you are not easily parented, right? You reject the notion of being parented for obvious reasons. The age of onset is before 5, and you have to be at least 9 months old to get this diagnosis. You have to have extreme neglect. There have to have been caregiver challenges, and there there could be institutional care. You cannot have autism. You have to rule out autism in order to rule in reactive attachment disorder. The persistence of it says that it will resolve with stable care. No, it won't. Stable care is not enough. There has to be a specific kind of care in order for it to resolve, and it does not resolve easily, and it does last a lifetime. So I actually disagree with this in terms of my experience over the last 25 years. The child is often at risk of social isolation. They don't seek help. They have a hard time making friends. They pal around with people who are not really friends, but maybe they're transactional relationships often. What can often be present with reactive attachment disorder is PTSD and depression, but also a myriad of other diagnoses, because almost all kids' diagnosis of RAD will also have 4 or 5 different diagnoses, because if you get this one, you'll end up with 4 or 5 others. So it would be PTSD, depression, anxiety, ODD, intermittent explosive disorder, just goes on and on. So you can end up with a lot of diagnoses if you have this one. And then the treatment focus would be attachment building with the caregiver. And that's actually true. That is the main treatment for kids with RAD. It's hard to get, it's hard to find, but it is the right thing to do if you have a child who has attachment challenge of any kind. So we're going to go into what the actual behaviors are in a minute, but I just wanted to give you that sort of condensed version there. But if we're looking at the difference between RAD and DSED, we're looking at something completely different. So while the reactive attachment child is emotionally withdrawn and avoids comfort, the DSED child is indiscriminately social, seeks comfort from strangers everywhere, including their attachment objects, like their parents or caregivers. They are extremely indiscriminate. They will go anywhere with anyone. It's scary, really, for parents who have kids who have this, because they wander off and attach themselves to young people, older people, adults, teenagers. It really doesn't matter. As long as the person is willing, they're willing to go. They're overly familiar. They're superficially joyful. They're very charming, overly friendly. They don't have boundaries. They don't respect other people's boundaries. It does have to be diagnosed before the age of 5 and after 9 months. Again, autism has to be ruled out, and it says ADHD, but that's kind of funny because they're going to get diagnosed with ADHD first. Both of them are reactive attachment disorder and DSED. They're going to get diagnosed with ADHD first. It persists despite the kind of care you have. It's boundaryless. It is a huge safety risk, a huge risk of sex trafficking, because they'll go anywhere at any time. They do have impulse control issues, and they would even if they weren't diagnosed with ADHD. And this also gets diagnosed with all the other things. So if they come with the DSED diagnosis, they're going to also have 4 or 5 others. And then what is the treatment focus? It's social boundaries and safety education and attachment building with caregiver. That's always going to be the answer if you have attachment and trauma issues in a relationship between the caregiver and the child, regardless if it's boundaryless or if it's over boundaried. Those two things need to be repaired by the caregiver-child relationship, not a relationship between the child and a therapist, but the relationship between the caregiver and the child. So that's just a quick overview. I wanted you to hear what these 2 diagnoses are. I don't like to work in these diagnoses very much, to be honest with you. I know you came here because you were hoping that I would really, really focus on these. But the reason I'm not going to is because these 2 diagnoses are outdated in terms of what we were really seeing in terms of attachment and trauma in the foster care population or kids who've been traumatized in the early years. And I'll tell you why. This is what I think more to be true, is that chronic and severe negative experiences in infancy and early childhood often result in what's known as complex developmental trauma. This is a much more accurate diagnosis that doesn't exist. So the DSM, which is the book that has all of the official diagnoses in them and where all psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, etc., get their diagnoses from, complex developmental trauma is not in there. So you can't give this as an official diagnosis, which means you have to default to one of those other 2, which often just doesn't quite explain it. Then what happens is neither RAD nor DSED get diagnosed, but then the child doesn't get diagnosed with anything that's appropriate. They get diagnosed with all those things around, like ADHD and ODD and conduct disorder and all of that, but none of that points to the root. And the root is attachment and trauma, not bad behavior. Right? Conduct disorder is 100% bad behavior diagnosis, right? You commit a crime and then you get that diagnosis. But that doesn't tell you why a person committed a crime or what are the underpinnings. And so it's really important to think in terms of what is the underpinning so that you can treat appropriately. Conduct disorder is treated with what? Juvenile hall. right? It's treated with some kind of detention or some kind of punishment, but that won't cure it. It won't fix it. It doesn't do anything. It just sort of holds it in its tracks. So it's not helpful. But what is helpful is a diagnosis like complex developmental trauma that points to what's actually happening in children who have this. And that's really what I want to explore today with you. So you have more language, even though your child is not going to get this diagnosis. Whenever I write a report for kids who maybe have been diagnosed with RAD or other things, if this is the root of their problem, I always start by saying that they are experiencing complex developmental trauma. And I use it as though it's a diagnosis. I can't get paid for that diagnosis if I were going to treat that, but I definitely use it as a diagnosis. One day it will be one because it is much more accurate and much more true to what our children are experiencing and what parents of these children are experiencing. So a better question to ask if you're trying to figure out if your child has attachment and trauma issues is what happened in the early years. It's the best thing to ask when anybody is having any kind of emotional difficulty, to be honest with you. What happened in your early years? So if you're 50, you're depressed and you've been depressed most of your life, if the person asking you questions about your symptoms doesn't ask you about your early years, then they're missing the boat on what might be happening to you, because trauma is a huge issue in our lives, whether we want to believe it or not. People are like, oh, everybody calls everything trauma now, like getting spanked is a trauma, losing first place is a trauma. And okay, I get that. I understand it. And that's not what I mean, but I do mean that, yeah, if you're spanked day in and day out for long periods of time because of your neurodivergence, or because you are scared, or because you don't know how to function because of some kind of brain difference, and you're spanked every day, yeah, that's traumatic, or if you're punished severely, that's traumatic. Even traditional parenting, which is perfectly fine, except if it's too severe, right? If it doesn't work and your parents ratchet up the interventions, then they're actually being very highly punitive, and most people would say abusive, because children don't need to be spanked and hit and shamed and physically manipulated in order to learn. They don't need that. But traditional parenting says, well, yes, they do. But when you get angry behind that, now you've ratcheted up the energy and made it much worse. So there's a lot to this, and it's important to ask what happened in your early years if you're struggling with any kind of mental health issue. But if we're talking about children, especially children we know come to us through foster care, or come to us through adoption, or come to us through kinship care, anything like that, then they had a life before us. And we need to be asking what happened in that life before us, because that's going to say a lot about what's going on inside their brains and their bodies, because attachment and trauma challenge is a brain-body issue. It's not a behavioral issue. So it's really important for us to truly understand what's happening and call it what it is and treat it for what it is, rather than thinking it's all about behavior and when we need to be parenting or fixing the behavior with behavioral interventions, because that actually won't work. So when we talk about what happened in early childhood, we're talking about those ACEs. Do you remember that study from Kaiser Permanente and the CDC a long time ago now? But it was a groundbreaking study. The numbers are escaping me right now, but I'm thinking 19,000 people were studied. And they discovered in that study that early childhood traumas that happened to you before 18 years of age, predicted medical and mental health problems in later years. And so those are adverse childhood experiences, and that's called the ACEs study. And if you wanted to take the ACEs study, you could just Google that, ACEs. The test will show right up. But what's on that test are questions that are very simple. They're only 10 questions, and they ask you, before the age of 18, did you have a parent who suffered from alcoholism or mental illness? Did you have a violent parent? Did you have a parent that was incarcerated? High conflict divorce is not on there. However, that is a traumatic experience for children. Child abuse of any kind, neglect. This is also not on the ACEs study here, disorganized attachment style in the primary parent. But we know it's true that if your caregiver in the first 2 years of life has some kind of disorganized attachment style, that the child is not going to have an organized attachment style when they get older. So they are going to struggle with attachment challenge themselves. So that's epigenetics, right? We can only get the level of attachment our caregiver has in the first 2 years of life. So if your mother is highly traumatized and had attachment challenge herself from her childhood, then when she has a child, she can only give you the level of attachment style that she has, which is going to be highly impacted by her early trauma, and so forth and so on. So which means that then when this baby grows up and has babies, they can only give their baby the level of attachment that they have. And this can be predicted. We can predict attachment styles years and years and years in advance of the generation that follows. So it's kind of intense research, but it's well proven now that epigenetically we pass on our attachment styles generation to generation. But early childhood adverse experiences impact our ability to attach, and trauma impacts our brain and our body from being able to mature properly. So I'm going to cover that in a second. But first, I want to talk about other kinds of traumatic experiences that can happen in the first 33 months. So what interrupts attachment in the first 33 months? Well, prenatal exposures to things like alcohol or other substances, domestic violence in utero, prenatal exposures. This is when the mom is pregnant and being exposed to domestic violence. Medical interventions when the mom is pregnant, and in utero surgeries because the child has some kind of medical problem and they decide to operate on the baby in utero. Believe it or not, that's a thing. And then birth complications, interrupted attachment. Let's say the baby's to be given up for adoption, then the birth mom loses her attachment to the child loses her attachment to the mom, and then the attachment is interrupted for a lifetime at that point. Premature birth and NICU stays interrupts attachment, and a mother's death, for example, from birth complications would impact attachment. Then there are separation trauma can happen in the early years, right? Separation from the primary biological parent due to foster care placements, multiple care placements, adoption placements. So at birth in the first 2 years and later, adoption placement, while it has positive implications, the experience of being severed from your biological parent impacts your brain and your body's development. And so your brain and body are changed as a result of that severing in the early years. It's different if the child gets severed from their biological parent a little later in life. They still can have attachment and trauma issues, but not in the same way, right? The brain is not necessarily changed by that attachment breach the way it is if it happens in the first 33 months. And when I say 33 months, I mean from conception out. So it's about 2 years from conception to 2 years. And then other things that interrupt or impact attachment and creates trauma are other big T or small t traumas. So chronic negative experiences. And so that would be like persistent poverty or homelessness, being raised in a war zone, or having immigration transients, discrimination and racism on a regular basis, death of a sibling, or prolonged bullying in childhood. Those things can contribute to attachment and trauma issues in the brain body of a young child. So this is really important to understand about raising any child that has attachment and trauma issues in the first 2 years of life, in the first 33 months. They are going to have 2 major brain injuries as a result of the trauma in early childhood. And so that's attachment trauma and abuse trauma, right? So the way it's complex. So the developmental trauma is one thing, but complex means there's more than one traumatic event. So there's attachment breach, which is a trauma, and then any kind of abuse, that's also a trauma. But if you have primary care biological breach, right, between the parent and the child goes to foster care, and then another foster care and another foster care, that's 3 different breaches of attachment. So that child tries to attach to the next person, and then they have to go to another foster care, and then they try to attach again, and then they have to go to another foster care, and then they at some point generally give up on that attachment process, and they're like, never mind, I'm not going to try this anymore. And then by the time they get adopted, perhaps they're like, yeah, done. I don't believe in attachment. I don't believe in parents. They don't stick with me. I'm not wanted by anybody. I never have been, and I don't believe I can trust anyone. So those are thoughts that I'm saying out loud, but these are not thoughts I'm talking about. I'm talking about brain-body imprinting that sends that message to the child's amygdala, which is the am I safe, am I not safe part of the brain. So 2 major brain injuries result from trauma in early childhood. And this is what they are. This is what almost all of you, if you have children who are foster adopt or adopted children, they are going to be suffering from dysregulation and dysmaturity at the same time. So the specific and profound brain changes from traumatic life experience are this. When you come from difficult beginnings, you are triggered wired into what's called chronic survival brain, right? It's activation of the threat system in the absence of the threat. So the child gets removed from their primary caregiver and their threat system gets flipped on like a light switch. Like, oh my God, I'm going to die without my mommy, basically. This is not a thought. It's a mind-body experience, right? The brain just goes into survival. The brain is being flooded with cortisol, which is stress hormone, and adrenaline. Stress hormone floods the prefrontal cortex. That's the executive function part of the brain. Executive function is where all of your decision making, morality, cause and effect, sequencing, empathy, things like that live. So if you're in chronic survival brain, activated in the absence of threat, meaning now you live with somebody who's safe, but you don't feel safe, you're chronically activated into survival brain. That means cortisol is chronically flooding your prefrontal cortex. And so your brain does not mature. It does not grow at the same rate as your body. So that cortisol flooding that prefrontal cortex causes dysmaturity. So dysregulation chronically leads to dysmaturity, which means then that children that you're raising who come from difficult beginnings are emotionally significantly younger than their chronological age. And what the research shows is that it works out to about half their age. So if they're 2, they act like 1. If they're 5, they act like 2. If they're 10, they act like 5. And I don't mean act. They're not acting. They are just being in life emotionally like a 5-year-old if they're 10, or being in life like a 2-year-old if they're 4, which is all good and fine, except when they're 15 and they're only 8 emotionally, now you're into some trouble. So you can see how chronic dysregulation leading to chronic dysmaturity becomes problematic as the child ages. So sometimes that chronic survival brain activation is called toxic stress. Toxic stress is really just cortisol flooding the prefrontal cortex. And it creates chronic emotional outbursting. When you don't like something, you scream because cortisol hits the front of your brain, and let's say it starts when you're 2 years old, then you scream and your brain gets frozen right there. Your body gets older, and at 3, you don't like something, and then your brain gets hit with cortisol and you scream and you sound just like a 2-year-old, and it just keeps going like that, right? You just stay at whatever place that is where you have a reaction, an outburst, but you don't have words, you don't have any real thinking attached to it, and you have no ability to regulate it. If that happens over time, then you end up having children who chronically are unable to act their own age. They have executive function delays, meaning they can't use their executive function. They can't think clearly a lot of the time, and they are still outbursting like they're much younger children when they get older. So sometimes it looks like very spiky age fluctuations. So like somebody who's 15 acts 15 some of the time, acts 35 some of the time, but also emotionally acts 8 a lot of the time, right? So has a hard time making decisions at a 15-year-old level, makes decisions more at an 8-year-old level, which you can see if you were learning how to drive, or you were supposed to be able to stay at your house for 4 or 5 hours alone, or you're supposed to be able to go to the library with your friend and come home at a certain time. Like all of those things could be really impacted if your 15-year-old emotionally acted more like an 8-year-old, right? Things could go really, really wrong. This is fundamental because these are the 2 ways that almost every child that I work with, it is every child I work with, have. And this is what you are constantly dealing with. It's nothing else. So when you think of things like ODD, right, or ADHD or RAD, whatever it is, what we're really talking about is chronic dysregulation and dysmaturity smashed into your kid. And your job is to figure out how do you parent that. And their job is to figure out how to survive you, because they're in survival brain and that's all they're thinking about is surviving. Turns out that if you're the parent, they're trying to survive you because they see you somewhat like somebody thwarting them, right? Somebody who's coming along trying to control them, trying to tell them what to do, trying to tell them that they're here to keep them safe, but they don't believe anybody can keep them safe, right? So there's a number of things that can be happening here where there's just this big smash of realities, right? Where parents think they should be able to keep their children safe while the children never believe that their parents can keep them safe. And that's where the dysregulation comes in, and the dysregulation itself causes the dysmaturity. If you've ever seen any of Bruce Perry's imaging studies, it's really painful. If you look at children's brains, 2 3-year-old brains side by side, one that's neurotypical, non-traumatized in a attached household versus one that is traumatized and has attachment challenge, the size of the brain is significantly smaller as a result. And that's what happens when you experience early life trauma. It changes your brain. You do not get a chance to fully develop your abilities, your cognitive abilities, your emotional abilities, your affective abilities, your spiritual abilities. I mean, really, all of your abilities get impaired. So let me give you an example of how it could go if you were Ellen, who's 29, and she's trying to figure out adulting with complex developmental trauma. Then what you would have is a 29-year-old who's dysmature in adulthood. So she's 29, but she feels and acts sometimes like she's half her age. She had difficulty launching, let's say. Let's say she stayed home until she was 24. Or let's say she ran away from home but didn't launch, right? Ran away from home and couch surfed for years, or ran away and lived in a flop house for a long period of time, or got involved in drugs or alcohol, right? So lots of things can happen during this period. Ellen, who's 29, also may have multiple early pregnancies, because if you have more than 5 ACEs, you are much more likely to have an early pregnancy than if you don't. And then if you do have multiple pregnancies when you're dysmature, then you don't do a very good job likely taking care of your children, especially if you have pushed away from other supports like family support because you've rejected that. Then you end up often losing your children to the system, which is essentially repeating what happened to you. If you were taken by CPS when you were a child, placed somewhere in permanent adoption, but then all of this does not get treated and moves forward, and it just repeats itself. The epigenetics repeat themselves. And so you end up losing your own children to the system as well. You may be unable to make use of higher educational opportunities, not because you're not smart, but because you can't apply your intelligence to the right things at the right time. You often have poor partner relationships because attachment disorder is relational disruption. It's a relational disorder. It's not a behavioral disorder. So your relationships are often very damaged and you have a very difficult time hanging on to them. And that starts very early. You might end up employed but underutilized, right? You are employed under your potential. You might be a waitress, or you might work at Jack in the Box or somewhere, because even though you have the capability and the intelligence to go to school, you didn't go. And also your emotional difficulties make it hard for you to keep employment, because when you get upset, you can't work. So you might end up staying home or not going to work as often as other people, or you might get emotionally disturbed at work and end up not being able to stay there, or get fired a lot, things like that. You may be emotionally volatile. One of the things that complex developmental trauma untreated grown up, especially if reactive attachment disorder was diagnosed, often will become borderline personality disorder diagnosed in adulthood. If you're familiar with that diagnosis, you will know that that is a little bit of the kiss of death diagnosis. Not as much today as it was, say, 20 years ago, but it is a difficult diagnosis to treat as a therapist, and a lot of therapists won't treat it because it is so volatile and so difficult to create a therapeutic relationship. A 29-year-old adult will still behave impulsively, make impulsive decisions, which impacts children, work, housing. This same 29-year-old may have poor esteem, profound worthlessness, and depression stemming from childhood abuses. They may swim in shame about not being good enough, about being worthless people, unwanted and unloved, regardless of whether they've been loved all along. But that early abandonment they experienced lasts a lifetime, and it feels like a hole in their chest often. A lot of times teenagers express it to me as a big black hole in their chest. It's painful to work with because they keep trying to fill it up with lots of things like snacks first. It starts out with snacks and sugar, and then it becomes people, and then it becomes drugs or alcohol and things. So a lot of times young people are trying to fill up that hole in them that comes from that primal wound with stuff to make themselves feel better. There is a great book on addiction as an attachment disorder. That's the name of the book, I think. It's a really good book of looking at addiction as just another expression of an attachment challenge grown up. So again, that Ellen, 29, might be diagnosed with BPD by 20. And also, if she was able to keep a child, she would likely, if this scenario were true, she would likely be parenting a reactive attachment disorder diagnosed son or daughter, because she would be passing on epigenetically her early beginnings. So that's dreary, isn't it? It's a dreary prognosis, but it doesn't have to be like this. It's that we haven't really, as a society, truly embraced what attachment trauma and abuse trauma does to children and how to go about healing it really early on. how to start early and how to stay with it and how to persist, because it needs persistence in parenting and it's hard to persist, right? You need a lot of support, and there's not enough support for parenting in general, right? Even if you have totally neurotypical, non-traumatized kids, it's hard to raise. But this is different, right? This becomes exponential once you get a child who has this level of impairment from trauma. Thank you for listening today to part 1 of Reactive Attachment, Diagnosed and Undiagnosed. In the next episode, I'll take you deeper into understanding complex developmental trauma, which can only be officially diagnosed as reactive attachment disorder or disinhibited social engagement disorder. One day, we will have a more specific diagnosis for the impact of multiple traumas on a child's brain. Until then, we'll have to go with what is, knowing that there is way more to the picture. I'll see you soon. And remember, your love matters when more than love is required.